Imagine waking up to find the machinery of your daily life has simply stopped. Banks are closed, gas stations empty, and power grids flicker out. People are waiting for hours, plastic containers in hand, just for a few drops of fuel to run a generator or a vehicle. Inside the grocery stores, the aisles are picked clean. Basic survival suddenly becomes a frantic daily struggle. This total standstill is the terminal stage of a sovereign default. It is a mathematical trap, years in the making, that only becomes visible to the public once the state's bank account hits zero. A sovereign default happens when a national government fails, or outright refuses, to pay back the debts it owes to foreign creditors. When a private company goes bankrupt, a court can step in, liquidate its assets, and sell off the pieces to pay lenders. But a country is a sovereign entity. You cannot liquidate a nation. Furthermore, governments possess what economists call autonomous rate-setting authority. Nisneem's estate has the unique power to raise taxes on its citizens or command its central bank to print more money to satisfy its domestic debts. Because a government holds those absolute levers of taxation and currency creation, deciding to break a contract with international lenders is a measure of absolute last resort. Doing so effectively exiles the country from the global economic system. A default's financial decay operates across three nodes. First, rising national debt forces a government to borrow just to pay interest. Next, depleted foreign reserves crash the currency. Finally, the central bank prints money, triggering inflation that destroys citizens' purchasing power. These three fatal symptoms operate entirely in the background. They destroy the nation on spreadsheets long before the public feels a single tremor. Consider Sri Lanka in the 2010s. The nation appeared to be a success story, generating a steady 5 to 6% annual GDP growth, heavily fueled by a booming, lucrative tourism sector. That growth was further supported by major export pillars, like garments and massive, lush tea plantations, creating a convincing illusion of robust economic health. But beneath that surface, Sri Lanka suffered from what economists call twin deficits. Despite the top-line growth, the government chronically spent more than it earned in taxes, creating a budget deficit. Simultaneously, the country imported more goods than it exported, creating a current account deficit. Operating an economy with twin deficits requires constant foreign borrowing just to maintain stability. The brittle system becomes entirely dependent on uninterrupted outside capital. The first major blow landed in late 2019. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa implemented sweeping, politically motivated tax cuts. This instantly drained government revenue and caused credit rating agencies to downgrade the nation, locking Sri Lanka out of international bond markets. Then came a catastrophic agricultural policy, a sudden ban on chemical fertilizers. This decimated domestic crop yields and forced the nation to spend its precious foreign currency importing basic foodstuffs. The fragile economy was then battered by dual external shocks. The COVID-19 pandemic wiped out global travel, suffocating the tourism industry, while the war in Ukraine caused a severe spike in the global cost of imported fuel and food. This line graph traces the country's foreign currency reserves. You can see how the combination of domestic blunders and global shocks caused those reserves to plummet from $7.6 billion down to a terminal $50 million. Hitting this near-zero threshold is the exact point where illiquidity turns into insolvency. The slow build ends, and the overnight collapse begins. In April 2022, the math caught up with reality. Sri Lanka was forced to suspend payments on $51 billion in external debt, officially defaulting. An international credit freeze means a nation literally cannot buy life-saving imports. Without foreign currency, the supply chains for essential medical supplies simply stop functioning. The government's attempts to print money triggered hyperinflation, which peaked near 70%. This rapid devaluation destroyed real incomes, pushing millions into poverty and sparking massive public outrage. That desperation ignited the Aragalia protests. Millions of citizens stormed government buildings and occupied urban plazas, eventually forcing the political leadership to flee the country. International bailouts and strict IMF austerity measures can eventually restructure the debt and fix a nation's spreadsheets. But the trauma and financial ruin inflicted on the people takes a generation to heal. The mathematics of a sovereign default require years to unravel in the shadows, driven by unchecked deficits and hidden financial rot. But the moment that final threshold is crossed, the collapse of daily life happens instantly. Imagine waiting in line on a dusty roadside for 40 hours just to buy a single container of fuel. For many, the sheer exhaustion and heat in these queues proved lethal. When citizens finally made it home, they were met with up to 13-hour daily power cuts that plunged entire cities into darkness. At the local market, basic survival became a luxury. The price of local staples like cabbage quadrupled in a matter of weeks. In April 2022, this was the daily reality for a thriving middle-class nation. That month, Sri Lanka officially declared bankruptcy. In financial terms, this is a sovereign default, the moment a country transitions from carrying debt to being completely insolvent. Sri Lanka drained its foreign reserves to absolute zero, leaving it unable to pay $51 billion in foreign obligations. When a nation's bank account hits zero, what is the exact physical chain reaction that dismantles the daily life of its citizens? The collapse was triggered by a toxic mix of events that quietly drained the central bank. Deep tax cuts in 2019, the COVID-19 tourism crash, and massive spikes in global fuel prices. To buy oil on the global market, a country needs US dollars. Without them, a government is instantly locked out of the global supply chain. That financial deficit manifests in the physical world. Shipping vessels stop arriving, and essential imports freeze at the borders, leaving massive industrial ports sitting idle. In a globalized system, a localized currency crisis acts as a physical barrier, severing a nation's lifeline to the outside world. The fuel shortage quickly reached the power grid. Domestic plants shut down, and the national fleet of supply trucks ground to a halt. When trucks can't move, the food supply breaks. Crops are left to rot in the fields because farmers cannot transport them to cities, driving food inflation to nearly 95%. This paralysis soon reached the factories. Without consistent power or imported materials, apparel manufacturers, the backbone of the economy, began closing their doors. For the workers who kept their jobs, real wages fell to their lowest levels in a decade. By mid-2022, 38% of the country was considered food insecure. Macroeconomic insolvency bleeds directly into the streets. It suffocates domestic industries and forces a middle class directly into poverty. Pushed to the brink by starvation and energy poverty, the public reached its breaking point. Citizens took to the streets in a movement known as the Aragalia, or the struggle. The movement was notable for its reach, uniting ethnic, linguistic, and economic groups that had rarely stood together against the state. The uprising climaxed when thousands of desperate citizens marched into the capital and occupied official government buildings, forcing the ruling leadership to flee the country. In Sri Lanka, the collapse of the economy effectively broke the social contract. When citizens could no longer afford to eat or move, the government's authority dissolved alongside the currency. To turn the lights back on, Sri Lanka turned to the International Monetary Fund, which eventually approved a $3 billion bailout. But IMF money comes with conditionality, strict mandated policies designed to ensure the country can eventually pay back its debts. On the ground, conditionality translates to austerity. To balance the national books, the government had to slash fuel subsidies, raise taxes, and hike utility prices. This creates a bitter paradox for the citizens. The cure for a sovereign default requires a government to intentionally induce deep financial pain to restore its credibility with international lenders. This chart tracks Sri Lanka's macroeconomic health. By 2024, data shows an official recovery underway, with GDP rebounding to 4.5. But the poverty rate remains high at 25%, double its pre-crisis level. The recovery hasn't reached the kitchen table. The crisis also left permanent scars on the workforce. Over 500,000 workers fled the country over a 2-year period, searching for stability abroad. A national economy doesn't collapse in a single day, but when the treasury finally runs dry, every single life within its borders changes with it, leaving human scars that outlast any economic chart.